Hello and welcome to the show. Today we sit down with Adam Dathi and discuss all things data, team, technologies, AI, you name it, we've discussed it. Let's dive in. Hi Adam, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on and telling us all about your experience and the world of data from your perspective. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your current role and how you found yourself there?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron, for having me. So my name is Adam Dathi. I have a background in strategy consulting, and then I've been in the world of data for 12 or 13 years now. So I started working for a startup, built up the data and BI team. I worked for a data consultancy called Redkite for about 2 years, and I was head of data at Farfetch for 4 years. And at the moment, I'm head of data at a company called MVF. In terms of who MVF are, they're an integrated media and marketing company. MVF has a number of different brands. They try to attract people to those brands, different customers. So there's a B2C department, and then there's also a B2B department. And we create engaging pieces of content. We attract different customers and clients, and then we connect them to suppliers who are our clients. So we have different brands like Eco Experts, Expert Reviews, Startups.co.uk. And the whole idea is to connect potentially willing customers and clients with people that can provide them with whatever it is that they're after.
Well, that sounds like an absolute wealth of experience. So, all that's left to do is dive in. So, I have a theory. So, I want to dive into your experience and your unique way into data. But I have a theory that data starts in companies in different parts of the organization, which affects the outcome. So, it might start in finance, and you get perhaps more a spreadsheet-driven view of the world, or it starts in ops and you get a sort of more reporting view of the world. I wonder, in your experience and in you're mostly in marketing-led companies, I'm guessing they've started in the marketing department, the data teams that you've worked in.
No, funnily enough, I would say that I've kind of crossed into marketing and media in a few different places. I'm not sure if I'd say it's even the majority of my experience of working in business and data. Maybe it's about half
Okay.
half of the time. But my initial experience was in strategy consulting, and I suppose to some degree, I think that that's influenced a lot of what I think data should be doing. So I think about data as an avenue to be able to make strategic decisions. So in some ways, I think it has actually influenced a lot of how I operate. But yeah, probably maybe not specifically from a marketing perspective.
Interesting. Well, actually, that maybe is even better, because with that kind of perspective from different approaches, I wonder then, does my theory hold any weight at all? Does where it starts in a company affect how the team develops and how the technology is used and how it's applied for decision making? Does the genesis actually make a difference?
I think it does. Going back to like some history of data, I think like Kimball, the Ralph Kimball who created dimensional modeling, I think most of what he discovered about data came from marketing and how marketing teams were using data. Marketing teams are very data driven generally. I think it's probably a fair assumption that where the background of the team, the background of the people probably plays an influence on where the strategic direction is of the data team. Yeah, I mean, do you have any specific examples like in mind when you were bringing this up?
Well, I suppose let's take a little step back to you and your role, and I guess why I sort of started from there, and perhaps we can circle back to it. So your company now, why don't you tell us a little bit about what MVF do and what you do for MVF, and then we'll get back to what I was thinking about in terms of how they use data.
Sure. So MVF is an integrated media and marketing company. The way that it operates is it has a number of different brands, like key brands. like Expert Markets or Eco Experts, TechCo, Startup.co.uk, and those brands in different ways try to connect interested customers or clients with companies that want to sell them something. A lot of it is brand content led marketing, and the way that it operates is it tries to create a kind of fairly end-to-end ecosystem where if a customer or consumer has a demand or a client wants to purchase a new SaaS product, then it offers content to help them along that journey and connects them to the right people that will be able to sell them the product. So that's essentially what it does.
Okay. And I think we see there's a lot of sources. So you tend to be taking from many different places to help with this decision making. Is that fair to say?
When you say sources, do you mean like conceptual sources, or do you mean like data sources?
I think both, actually, because you could imagine a system that had just one connector, but it had a lot of different inputs from different kinds of departments. I think what I see and people say quite a lot is that marketing tends to demand many different types of products to be connected because they're using a lot of different types of products.
I think that is very true. And I know that we've had a conversation before about the number of different connectors that MVF uses. So you've probably seen we've got like a really long tail of different sources that we're interacting with. And you're right, there's a very long tail of different marketing sources. However, they also use some of the big prominent ones as well.
Yeah. And if you compare that then to finance led or the kind of consulting type roles and companies that you've been in, are they similar? Do they have a lot of sources, or do they tend to have one really high volume data source that you have to analyze in a lot of detail? Are they different?
I would say that there's some level of sophistication with lots of the connectors. I never felt like at least MVF's stack was that fundamentally different, but it's also because I think it depends on how mature the marketing departments are. And I think that does actually play a big factor, almost in a slightly industry agnostic manner. If you have like a really diverse marketing kind of audience that you're trying to engage with, and you're doing it through lots of different channels, trying to do it via influencers, and you're using Google and Facebook and all the standard stuff, as well as lots of internal tools, then I think it does become a lot more complicated. But in a sense, I'd say that is more industry agnostic. You could probably judge it more by the size of the company, especially the amount of legacy products that they have, the different markets that they're in, like geographies. I think that there's probably quite good correlation between those different aspects and how many connectors they end up using. Legacy stuff in particular.
That actually makes total sense, doesn't it? The most influential thing is how big the company is, how much, how varied their trading is, what actually is going on for the company. And would you call then MVF quite sophisticated? The marketing team there is after a very data-led approach to their decisioning.
Yeah, I'd say that they are. And to a certain extent, I'd say that they almost have to be, because that is the way in which they're going to differentiate themselves. So I think for lots of companies, they may try to sell themselves on the product, but for MVF, the marketing is part of the product in a sense, because we're saying we can connect you with the right people. And how do we find those people? In terms of customers and clients, we need to attract them via different marketing campaigns. So I think that they need to be as sophisticated as they can.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, actually, and somewhat disproves my sort of general idea that the sophistication arrives because of where it started in the company. And actually, it makes total sense. The size is far more important. And so you're relatively recent at MVF. You've been dropped into these kind of leadership roles in other companies. What did you find? What did you sort of have a preconceived idea about what to do? What was the journey like in the first little while after you joined?
I think luckily there was already a fairly clear idea about some of the things that MVF wanted, which in some ways made my job fairly straightforward. So, for example, they brought me in. One of the big things that they wanted to do was to invest in data science. So they wanted to find potential data scientists. They wanted to work with them to look at the roadmap, understand if there's a lot of value and whether it justified further investment. There were certain other things as well in terms of looking at the Scrum setup of the team. But I'd say that they probably had a fairly clear idea of what they wanted me to do. There's some companies that I've entered, and in some ways, it's easier because of my experience. If they have less of an idea of what they want to do, sometimes it's easier to prove value. Whereas, funnily enough, I felt like MVF in many ways was quite mature, and they knew what my remit should have been. And a lot of it I agreed with, which is less interesting a conversation to have. Usually I like it when I say, I disagree with this. I think we should be doing these things that are fundamentally different. I think that's that part of my consultancy background. I like it when I can say something that's different to what they're currently doing, as opposed to, here's our ideas about what you should be doing. Do you just want to implement it, or do you want to do something different? In this particular case, it was very similar to what they'd already had an idea of doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is, I can definitely see that. If you come into a mature team with mature processes, and albeit the head of it, it's quite hard to then rip it all apart and tell them to do it differently. That's illogical. Like, why would you do that? Whereas if you go in and it's a mess and things are falling to bits, and actually adding a bit of process, you could show some real value, because hey, we're more organized now and there's less fires day to day, and that helps in terms of adding value when you join.
Yeah, exactly. I think that you no longer, if things are going wrong, the only way is up. Like, you can't make things much worse. So it's a good position to be in if you have a certain level of experience and you're going into a position, you think there's lots of things that you easily could change to make things better, then often that's a good position to be in. Easy way to prove value.
Yeah.
I also believe in something that I've kind of taken on from a Scrum coach approach, which is that when I enter teams, I usually don't try to change things straight away. I try to get a good feeling for what's going on in the company and what do I think makes sense. And often one of the things that I might end up changing initially are the ways of workings of the team. And there were some things that we ended up kind of tweaking and changing and improving. But fundamentally, I don't think things are that different. And they're not that different in terms of the ways of working, because I don't think they needed to be. So I like to think about the change.
Did you look for a role that? Sorry, did you look for a role that had Scrum ways of working? Like, that obviously suits you. That would be how you would guide things. But was that a mistake, or that's kind of like a happy coincidence that you found a role that it's a Scrum based?
I think it was, if anything, like lots of the analytics engineering teams that I've worked with like to operate in sprints, but I've also done some kind of Scrumban approaches, like a hybrid between Scrum and Kanban. I wouldn't say that I specifically looked out for it. If it didn't exist, if there was nothing really there, then I probably would have evaluated whether I could have implemented it. The fact that it was already there means that it's kind of aligning with the industry, because I think that's what the majority of the teams operate. So, I wouldn't say I looked out for it. If anything, I would have almost liked it if they were earlier on in that journey, and then I could have helped them a little bit more. But they're already fairly developed. I think they've been doing it for a year before I joined.
Yeah. Then it can't all be smooth sailing. What stuff does go wrong? So it sounds like the team's working well. Are there other things that don't quite go to plan?
You mean at MVF or in data? My experience,
I suppose, it's always nice to talk about the current role and what's happening sort of day to day. But maybe it's worth sharing your experience of what does go wrong in data teams. If the team's working well, there might be the technology's a problem, or it might be working with the rest of the company, the interface. There could be a lot of different things that could go wrong. I suppose in your experience, it's fascinating to understand what does go wrong. What do you see?
I generally don't see as many issues with the technology itself, but I think MVF has had some issues with some technology vendors. But generally, I think that those are rarer. Like if you're using a fairly modern tech stack, which they are, then things generally seem to operate fairly well. Where I see some of the issues in data arising, I see sometimes some issue with migrations. I mean, that's often a problem. Like when you realize that there's some kind of legacy architecture and you want to align it and rationalize it, and then you want to migrate, that's sometimes quite costly, difficult. I often see issues with interfacing between different teams and competing priorities. Specifically, like upstream teams that then feed onto data. I think that that's a very common problem. So something breaks, and then the data team might investigate it, and they realize it's an upstream change that they actually didn't have any control over. And in general, I think data's place often within a company can be a bit of a topic of discussion. When should they be brought into projects? Are people aware that if they make certain changes in tech systems, then it might have a downstream effect? I think
I like that way of talking about it.
You like the way of talking about it?
Yeah. So I like that way of talking about it, because a lot of people talk about it as a data quality issue, but actually it's more like a data team to rest of company interface issue. Like, if people don't even know that downstream there's a data team to worry about, of course the quality's going to be, that's kind of how it's surfaced, but that's not exactly where it starts.
Yeah. I think that this is a lot to do with the company's internal ways of working rather than necessarily like a data quality problem. Data quality now makes it sound like it's the data team's responsibility. And there is a responsibility to make sure that the data is good quality. But it's not specifically a data problem. It's a company problem that surfaces via the data. And it's just usually lack of alignment. And I do think generally, in lots of the places that I've worked in, data quality is an issue, and I've seen different levels of investment in trying to support it, trying to correct it. But quality is something that I think in most teams that I've seen, they could be doing more to monitor the quality of what they're producing. Also think that SQL itself doesn't lend itself well naturally to things like unit tests. There's certain best practices that would be there if you were from more of a development background, a software engineering background, and it's taken a little while for it to start to migrate down into more of the analytics world.
Yeah, exactly. It tends to be, characterizing a little bit, it tends to be that the data team's expected to follow fast and just sort of put up with what they get. And, that is obviously really hard. That's a really hard place to be, because either you're pressed for time or you've got no ability to change your inputs. So that definitely hampers what you can produce. That seems to be a data team's lot in the world. And like you said, actually calling it a data quality issue almost lands it in the data team, and that's kind of unhelpful in its own way.
Yeah.
What would you do about it then? In the ideal world, what would the perfect solution be?
I mean, the perfect solution is that you co-develop solutions. So if there's a change to an upstream system, then the data team is informed at the right point. But I've always had these discussions about what is the right point. So do you involve them too early? Because if you do, then there's not much that they can really contribute to the conversation. And if you involve them too late, then they end up having to respond too quickly, or something just breaks, and then you end up with an end consumer that's telling you this metric doesn't work anymore. Can you fix it? What's the problem? I mean, lots of the ways in which I think companies are now trying to solve this is to do with is via more sophisticated data quality tools to be able to understand where there is a problem and be able to understand before the customer. But that's kind of the last resort. Beyond that, I think it's more about like data governance and having closer relationships with the engineering teams. Often I've seen that trying to be solved via product managers. So product managers from engineering teams, software engineering teams, starting to coordinate with the product owners from a data team, be that a separate product manager or maybe the manager of a data team, depending on who's doing that role.
Yeah.
I
see that. I see that quite a lot with product management, that it's quite easy to understand the user interface and what they're making the product look like. It's a lot harder for them to articulate what they want their own reporting or what the outputs to be. That sort of that tends to be to the natural way of the world, that they wait till afterwards to think about the output. Whereas it's obviously an awful lot better if they can think about what they want to get out at the beginning.
Yeah, I feel like this is a kind of data culture and data maturity type problem. I think it's often almost unfair to expect a product manager to be able to understand what the data implications are. So I've seen this in a few different places. In fact, it's kind of the same at MVF and also at Farfetch. We had this as well, where there would be certain product managers associated with specific teams that were non-data related. And then because data is a horizontal discipline, you operate across if you have a centralized data team, they operate across loads of different businesses and verticals, departments. Whoever's the product owner for that data team cannot reasonably expect it to go and interface with every single team in the company and work out what are the requirements, how do you bring it all together.
Yeah.
So one of the ways in which people try to solve this is you already have product managers or product owners for those specific departments or those other non-data teams. Why don't we just get them to interface with the central data product owner? And then, then we've kind of bridged that gap. And whenever that's happened, I found that the non-data product owners struggle to understand how to articulate the data needs that they might have, and also to think there might be a data implication to us changing the source system. So in some ways, it simplifies the problem because you at least know who you're supposed to speak to. But on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily solve the underlying issue, which is there's potentially a lack of data maturity because data isn't the first thing that a product owner that owns, a payment system will be thinking of. They won't think about, well, how will we report on what these payment metrics are? And that's understandable. That isn't their primary objective. So sometimes it can be difficult.
I guess that is in the same way you wouldn't put security in you'd have a principle across the whole company, but you wouldn't put the responsibility into every single team. You would centralize it to some degree. That makes tons of sense to do the same thing with data. Why? It's a cross-company concern. Centralizing it makes lots of sense.
Yeah.
What is it that you think? Heading back to MVF and the way things work, I was quite fascinated at a talk we were both at the other day. And you're on the panel of the marketing mix model. One of the guys I was sat next to was in a completely different industry, and that's a very specific way of using the data. But he could immediately see how it was useful elsewhere and in other disciplines, not in marketing. And I wonder then, in your experience, is that something you've spotted as well, that there are multiple cross-functional, very similar ways of using data that perhaps we could do a better job of, as an industry, thinking about the patterns of, thinking about how we share and make more of that knowledge?
Yeah, I think that is true. I think that the underlying tools that you might end up using to solve data problems are actually very universal. They're industry agnostic. Almost doesn't matter which department you're speaking about. And so if you have a good encyclopedia of the different ways in which you're solving problems for one team, you'll probably find out that you could actually apply them to lots of other departments. It's why if I was hiring for an analyst, someone in a data role, sometimes it doesn't matter to me what their industry experience has been more about what technical skills they have learned over that time and their attitude and their
Yeah,
behaviors. Those things are more important to me than
absolutely.
specific domain experience. Um,
Yeah.
but domain experience can definitely help you hit the ground running. I've also found that lots of the companies will have lots of idiosyncrasies with their own data, and it will take you a while to learn about some of those idiosyncrasies. So it
Yeah.
means that even if someone was very experienced at, let's say they're really experienced marketing analyst, but then they go to a different company that has a completely different data warehouse, different data models, all that have their own nuances, there's still a lot of learning that you end up needing to do before you can add value.
Yeah, I definitely see that as well. The other thing that I think the domain knowledge really helps with is just the naming. Like every single
Yeah,
place, every single customer I go to, even if it's the same industry, they have their own names for things, and it can be really either frustrating or quite hard to really understand what they're talking about, just because they're calling this thing that everyone knows and that whole culture that's built up over time. Everyone knows what that is, and you come in from the outside, and of course you have no idea what that widget is in their lingo. The other
and
thing I'm
sometimes
interested
they have.
in is
So I was
go
going
on,
to
sorry,
say
go
that
again.
sometimes they have the different names for the same thing as well. So even to have a
Oh yeah,
single
you
name
can
within the
definitely
same
get that
company,
with
that's
10
impossible.
names for
Yeah,
that.
I mean, you probably
Yeah, that
encounter
is
that a lot in your work with Matatika, right?
that is very much our what we have to deal with, I suppose, is that different types of customers, different types of industries, and when you get into a company and a project, you're trying to rapidly try and understand what they are talking about, what they call them, so get the right point across. And it's, like you said, sometimes a big company, they're all calling the one thing multiple things. They haven't decided themselves what they're going to universally call it. And that part of what we might do is try to repeat the one most popular thing and sort of almost influence that's what we're going to call it now. That's especially if we're building a data model or building out, writing documentation and trying to make sense of it for them. That's far from easy.
Yeah, that's what a lot of data governance projects I've been involved with in the past. They've all been trying to achieve. So let's try to standardize our terms. Let's get a standardized business glossary. Let's build a proper data dictionary. That just takes a lot. It takes a lot of time to be able to do something like that effectively.
What, in your experience, has there been return on that investment?
Um, I mean, generally, I think that there has been a return of investment, but a return on investment. The issue that I see is that it's almost like writing good quality code or like well documented code. You kind
Mm,
of do it with the hope that sometimes you don't need to do it, or like it wouldn't actually need to be useful, or like writing good handover material so that if you were to leave the company, then would someone else be able to take it over? I think some of the value for having very good data governance as a best practice is kind of hidden into the long term of the company. But
yeah,
occasionally there's some points where it's just really confusing, and then solving that, you have an immediate impact. Like you have multiple different terms, and people don't know which field to use within the data warehouse because there's lots of different competing definitions. So you standardize it, and then there is some immediate value. Um,
yeah,
I almost see this as a bit of a hygiene factor because sometimes it's really difficult to quantify how much more effective would this organization be if we had fewer terms and fewer fields, and our Looker instance was less messy and we could find the right explorers in the right fields
mm,
more easily? Or what's the cost of someone running the wrong report and making some decisions off the back of it? It's a difficult thing to
yeah.
quantify.
That's very consistent with my experience as well. You get you get one person who tends to maintain a quality level, what they consider good enough, and if it's then adopted by all and it's sort of part of what we do, as a team, you sort of reach that that level of understanding of what good enough is, and then you kind of get these incremental benefits. You don't really know what the world would look like without them. When I see a big investment trying to build out and improve the data, governance, the documentation, the what we know about the data, it tends to be really hard work. People don't really appreciate what they're doing it for because they can't see the immediate benefit. And there's this massive lift, and often it fails then because they don't get the reward themselves, let alone see what it's doing for the company. And it's very much what you said there. It's hygiene, what you should be just doing, and probably better off incrementally changing ways and improving what is acceptable going forward. It's very difficult to go back and see the value of making everything clean and tidy. It looks like technical busy work sometimes.
Farfetch did like a fairly large investment in data governance. They took it very seriously, and they had a dedicated data governance team and a head of data governance. And I think sometimes if you're a large enough company and the data ecosystem has enough legacy and is kind of enough nuances to it, and you can articulate that it's enough of a problem, then sometimes you can get that kind of investment. But it's much better generally if you start things in a fairly data governance consistent manner right from the start. But most of the time, that's just not how people want to operate because you don't need it at the beginning.
Exactly. Yeah. The one of the probably the funny things about data is, like we mentioned security earlier. Often, if there's a breach or a hack of some sort, there's a catastrophe. You take action. You take action to make it better. If your IT systems go down, if there's an outage, it's a catastrophe. There's it's a great big smoking hole problem. You've got to sort this out, and then you make processes to make it better. I'm not sure I can put my finger on what the catastrophe is in data. If I had to have a go, it would be trust is so lost in the data that nobody uses it anymore. Like that's the kind of, but it doesn't feel like a great big smoking hole. It's not as obvious what the big problem with that is. Do you see like what would be your smoking hole problem in data?
I think it depends upon if we're talking about analytics workflows or if we're talking about operationalized workflows that involve data. So let's say, for example, you have a machine learning model that's being used by the company and there's no fallback. So the machine learning algorithm goes down and all of a sudden you can't do something. So for example, at MVF, we're looking at lead scoring. If the lead scoring was then going to be used for different marketing campaigns, that happens on a daily basis. So we, as a bit of context, by lead scoring, I mean a lead, we create a lead, we get a lead by paying for different marketing channels. So we get a new client or a new customer onto our site that's interested in a product that our clients can provide them with. We want to score how good that lead is. What's the probability that it's actually going to convert for our clients? There's that lead score could then be operationalized, where we use it to be able to work out which marketing channels are we investing in. We could give it to Google in a Performance Max campaign so that Google optimizes what leads it's giving us or what traffic it's driving to our site based upon this metric. If that then breaks or we start giving some erroneous figures, then you can actually start to see an impact on revenue. And at least for MVF, there are some operationalized data use cases. Beyond that, so I sometimes think that some companies want to make a clearer distinction between operational workflows and kind of data workflows, which is sensible. There's lots of different reasons why you might want to do that. So operational ones aside, where you can see an immediate impact on like revenue and costs and other things. From a data perspective, I think it depends on what decisions are going to be made with that data. If there's nothing that's critical, and it could be a strategic decision or a marketing decision, a finance decision that's going to be made based upon the data, and that data is wrong, the wrong decision was made, or that data is late, they can't make the decision, then I think it's mostly about trust. But I would like to believe that in lots of the organizations, the more mature they become with data, the more they will care if something breaks.
Yeah,
So I
I'd agree.
suppose it's the goal of, there's a kind of competing goal, I think, as a data leader, where you want data to be so important that everyone needs it because you believe that that will make the company better. In the same sense, you also want to cover yourself so that if something breaks, then that doesn't mean that the company is going to lose money because of it.
Yeah, that is actually, like, when you put it in that context, you're actually in a really important role, but you almost don't want them to trust it too much without questioning it too much, because it could lead to a very poor decision, because you don't necessarily have full control of the supply or full control of the outcome yourself. You're dealing with as we said earlier, perhaps poor quality sources, or you're dealing with less than ideal governance and less than ideal hygiene around what's going on with the data. So there's a lot of debate presently, I think, trying to improve the quality. But actually, I think if we talked about it in those terms, improve the confidence, improve the real understanding of where it comes from, the decisions that are possible and the ones that are not. Maybe that would be far more successful, instead of saying data quality and putting it back on the team as a them problem.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
I suppose some of this comes back to how I view data, but like I said, because of my background, I kind of view it in terms of I'm helping inform decision making in the company, be that automated by machine learning, or whether it's actual strategic decisions that I made or operational decisions that I made. So I think that when we're thinking about data quality and the cost of data and what we want data to be able to achieve, it also has to be tied back to what is the final outcome that we'd like for the company. So it needs to be very value driven. If it's the case that data is used all over the company, people use it on a daily basis, but in reality, they don't need to. They could just make all the decisions off of gut feeling, and that would end up with exactly the same output. I think that's completely theoretical. But if that were the case, then data shouldn't really have much value, right? Because it's the value of data is contingent on how much better those decisions would be.
So
if your benchmark is already just as good as you would achieve, then data doesn't add that much additional value. I mean, I would argue that.
I really like that. Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, in fact, what I'm then thinking is, well, how would you measure that? How would you measure the importance and significance of the decisions that you make possible? And that's perhaps a topic for a future conversation.
I'm not even sure if I've
Adam,
got an answer, even if we were.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm thinking. It might be a beer conversation.
Yeah. I mean, really, I think it's up to the stakeholders to determine how valuable was this information in changing your decisions. But like, what's the counterfactual here? What would have happened if there was no data? I mean, we don't know. It's up to those people who are hopefully asking for data to be able to tell us that this is actually really valuable. It's one of the weird things is that I was saying that ideally we need to evaluate the value of data based upon this incremental benefit. But really, it all comes down to what the stakeholders tell us. So if someone who is making a decision that's worth hundreds of million says, I need this data, it really helps my decision making, then it's a really difficult thing to do an A/B test on that to be able to work out exactly how important it is. But we kind of just take them at their word. If someone who's making these big decisions says, I need the data to make these big decisions, then chances are they need the data. So how much would you be willing to invest to make it possible?
In some ways, I prefer the tangibleness of those roles where they're looking for savings or they're looking for value. One of the things I enjoy about going to events and meeting people from different industries is that one guy I was talking to recently, they found a kind of 50 million cost saving within their operating model through what they could tune and tweak and make better just from observing the data. And that's that's glorious compared to, well, here's some information and here's a kind of intangible decision, a support decision making role. It's not as doesn't feel as easy and as satisfying as if you really link it back to thin margins all over the place. That feels more tangible.
How significant was that 50 million for that company? It must have been a huge company if they made 50 million saving.
Yeah, it was an energy company, and it was
Right.
absolutely right. So actually, funnily enough, I don't think it was something that would change the bottom line, report to the shareholders. I mean, it was a massive company, so that's always scary in some ways. That level of difference would hardly even show up on the radar.
Yeah.
That was the other part of it for me. I was like, that's bonkers. That's how could it be that way? And it's very easy then to justify a relatively modest growth in your data team if you're going to make that kind of return. Whereas I think a lot of people are in that situation where trying to grow their team by 1 or 2 or 5 people, it's really hard to justify. Not only can you not link it back to a tangible revenue benefit or profit benefit, you can't even really make a tangible measure of it, and that's tough.
Yeah, because that would just, I mean, I don't know how big a data team would need to be to justify 15 million if they could say that they could do that every year. I mean, not that they could.
Yeah.
That
And
one
actually, it was only 5 people in the team.
What's that?
Team of 5 people finding that kind of saving.
I think that this is also sometimes part of the issue with saying that you're going to invest in data. The size of the team sometimes doesn't necessarily correlate with how much of an impact they're going to make. That 50 million savings, I don't know whether they're going to make anywhere close to that saving next year. I mean, that might have been a one-off. It's interesting.
Yeah, I imagine it's the typical model, isn't it? It's not always going to be incrementally that step change in benefit, but sure there's most companies, those sort of fine margins, you can always make small improvements and then they add up. But who knows? I'll have to go to the next event and bump into him again.
I'd love to hear about some like savings or some optimizations that were made that made like a huge material difference to some smaller companies, or like just a big percentage change, because I'm sure that they exist.
Yeah. In your roles, have you had that experience? Have you been sort of on the either delivery end or receiving end of a kind of something that's game changing for a company?
I don't know about like game changing. I think I worked at a startup probably about 10 years ago, and a lot of the decisions that we were making were fairly large for the company because we were making like investment decisions, or where should we be investing our money in, which marketing channel, what are the big deals that we need to close in order to like make sure that we can get enough money to last until the next round of funding. Like there were lots of decisions that were made that were fairly critical, and they were informed by data. In terms of like game changing, where I've been in a company where they implemented something that was data related and made a huge difference, I don't think so. I think a lot of it has been either fairly core to the business or like incremental. But I'm interested as well. I've heard about stories like even at Farfetch where things like that would happen, where people managed to suddenly make their marketing investments far more efficient because they didn't have marketing analytics, and then they had it for the first time. But
they
usually,
found that opportunity.
Yeah, I think a lot of the data teams I've come into, the data infrastructures, for maybe like the last 6 years, 7 years, have been fairly mature, fairly developed. So there's been improvements, but in order to create that step change, you almost need something new that wasn't there before. Whereas a lot of what I think I've been doing in the last 6 years or 7 years has been incremental improvements. Who knows? Maybe data science,
almost
learning. What's that?
Like we said earlier with joining a team, if you join a part of the business that's perhaps gone through massive growth or massive cost pressure challenges, well, there's an opportunity and you can make a difference. I wonder then, as you were talking about that, there's a topic I've been asking people about, and that's around AI and its use of AI. One of the big use cases I think people want is that kind of intelligence to spot those opportunities. I wonder if you think that's a reality. Like, do you think that's do you think that's something that is even viable for the generative AI technologies, or generally from AI, or do you think it's a sensible, observant person? Like, what is it? Somewhere in between? Is it what do you think? The sort of future point of AI in and around data is.
I think when it comes to like step changes in companies, I don't think it would. I think we're really far away from AI being able to generate some idea that's going to be really impactful for a company without them asking for it almost explicitly. Do you know what I mean? Like it's going to have to be directed towards it.
Yeah.
I think that there's going to be lots of improvements in AI, and its involvement in data and across different companies is obviously going to increase. But we're almost saying, like, at what point will AI come up with the next big idea that's going to improve things within a company? Like, notice that you're spending way too much in this area, this doesn't make sense, or I don't know, this new region is opening up, or this new region is increasing in terms of the total population size, and that's actually perfect, or this is the ideal demographic that you should be going for. I think we're quite far away from anything like that.
I'd agree.
Yeah, I think we're quite far.
I'd agree. Yeah, I think, like you said, it's really optimal at identifying clusters of what you ask for. So, it actually, funnily enough, lacks the intelligence bit entirely, because it can't spot them without any decent prompting from human, or the other kind of not literally prompting necessarily, but actually like guiding your data and your questions and your model towards something that you've already thought could be a possibility.
Yeah.
I agree. It's far from being able to sort of just detect where the best next opportunity is at the sort of company across multifaceted parts of a company. It's just not there yet. Perhaps with more data and more sources, it can get there. But yeah, that seems far.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that it's going to face as well is that lots of companies just don't want to share that kind of data with it. Like, if I think that LLMs, like AI in general, is going to be particularly useful if people were very open about sharing company-related information. So if you knew exactly how other people in your industry were creating their data warehouses, I'm talking from a data perspective, but obviously this is far more far-reaching than this. Which marketing channels they wanted to invest in, what were their key demographics, how are they marketing their, what was their USP? Like, if you have all of this information, you're aggregating it across all the companies in the world, then I'm sure you can create loads of amazing insights for a company that's doing things differently, where you can start to say, you should be creating your material like this. Your website could be optimized by doing these things. You should create your data infrastructure, your tech products like this. But I think I think that there's always going to be this proprietary information, this like gulf between.
Yeah, because everyone's protectionist, aren't they?
Yeah,
they're a long way off sharing completely openly every facet of information that they have, and that's either because it's a competitive advantage, or they're just worried. That's like, what are they actually letting go out the door? So I agree that you're not going to have the availability of information until something else changes. There's the one thing that happened recently that probably you got me thinking the most is the level of investment that went into OpenAI. There must be people taking a bet that human level intelligence could be on the horizon, or could be possible. I mean, that just the investment is so huge that the vision then has to be enormous. It can't be simply a profitable tool or something. It has to be people are thinking this is going to change humanity kind of level. That's how big the investment appears to be. And that certainly gets me thinking, well, maybe it's possible, but it still seems, when you're at the coalface of making data available, that seems quite unlikely, where we're sitting now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree.
Adam, thanks for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed every minute of our discussion that's covered a huge and wide range of topics. Hope to see you again very soon.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. See you soon.
See you soon.